Her husband left her for a younger girl until a rancher found her face down in the dust. What happened next left him speechless. She was lying in the red desert dirt. The sun sat directly above her, offering no mercy and no shade. The only sound was the dry wind dragging itself through the brush. Her pink dress, the one she had worn on the day she still believed in him, had gone dark with sweat. Her hair fell loose across her face. One hand was stretched out ahead of her, palm open, fingers wide, as if she had released everything she had ever held all at once. 3 years before this moment, far away from here, she had been a bride in Virginia. She had a mother who looked at her and said, "Magnificent," like it was simply the truth. She had a name that carried weight. She had a home, a life, and one man, a careful man, a patient man, a man who placed every step with quiet calculation. Then her husband found a younger woman, 18 years old, soft where Elora was too much, delicate where Elora took up space. And so while she was away nursing her dying mother, Paul Bunyan had slowly, deliberately taken her entire world apart, piece by piece, paper by paper, until there was nothing left but $20 and a locked door. But to understand what happened next, you will need to stay with us. To understand how one man's cruelty became one woman's reclamation, how the wife he threw away became the woman who left him speechless, we must first go back. We must first go back to a June morning in 1882, when the Virginia air was thick with honeysuckle and the kind of optimism that only exists before a woman learns what a man is truly made of. The church was small but proud, dressed in white linen and wildflowers that Elora Chapman had arranged herself before sunrise. She had worked quietly, the way she did everything, with her hands and without complaint, pinning sprigs of baby's breath to the ends of each pew, smoothing the altar cloth twice with the flat of her palm. By the time the guests arrived, the room looked like something out of a dream. Mary had made sure of that. She wanted her daughter to have a beautiful beginning, even if she already felt, somewhere deep in the marrow of her, that beautiful beginnings were sometimes the cruelest kind. Elora stood in the small back room with her veil not yet pinned, holding her mother's lace gloves in both hands. They were ivory, slightly yellowed at the fingertips, and had been worn by Mary on her own wedding day 31 years before. They smelled faintly of cedar and of something older than that, of all the quiet endurance that had been stitched into the Chapman women across generations. Elora had asked to wear them. Paul had suggested she didn't. He had said it gently, the way he said most things in those early days, with a smile that arrived just a half-second too late. Something new would be more fitting, he had told her. We don't need to be sentimental. She wore them anyway. Mary came to Elora just before the doors opened. The organ had already begun its slow, swelling announcement, and the guests had risen to their feet, and there was no more time for long conversations. Mary took Elora's face in both hands, still strong hands, working hands, and looked at her the way only a mother can look at a daughter, like she was reading something the rest of the world was too distracted to see. "He is handsome," Mary said quietly, "and he knows it. Men who know it tend to borrow against it. They spend what they have on the surface and leave the deeper rooms bare." Elora had laughed, soft and nervous. "Mama!" "I am not saying don't go." Mary smoothed the veil with 2 fingers, precise and unhurried. "I am saying watch for the rooms he doesn't show you. A man with a hollow heart will always give you the parlor first. He'll keep the rest locked until you've already signed your name to everything." The doors opened then, and the light fell in, and Paul was standing at the altar in his dark coat, with his hair combed back and his jaw set the way it always was, like a man who had already decided how the story would end. He was striking. Elora's breath cocked the way it always did when she saw him from a distance. That was the thing about Paul Bunyan. He had a talent for looking like an answer. She walked toward him on her father's arm, and Mary stood at the end of the front pew and watched, and she did not cry the way the other women did. She held her handkerchief in her lap, folded, unused, and she watched her daughter take the hand of a man she had known, in her quiet and incurable way, was going to cost Elora something tremendous. The ceremony was brief and bright. The vows were spoken. The lace gloves caught the light as Elora lifted her hand to receive the ring. Afterward, at the reception, Paul slipped the gloves from Elora's hands almost without her noticing. He set them on a side table near the window. "You don't need them anymore," he said, and kissed her temple, and went to greet his business associates with the broad, easy confidence of a man who had just acquired something he intended to improve. Mary found the gloves an hour later. She folded them carefully and tucked them into her coat pocket. She never gave them back to Elora, not then. She was saving them for when her daughter would need them again.
She had not noticed it happening at first. That was the most precise cruelty of it, the way Paul's erosion of her came not in floods, but in drops, patient and consistent, the way water will eventually hollow out even the most solid stone if given enough time and no resistance. The first year of marriage had the texture of something real. They had a house on Clement Street with a wide porch and a garden Elora tended with genuine joy. She cooked large meals and laughed loudly and filled whatever room she entered the way her mother had always filled rooms, with presence, with warmth, with the particular energy of a woman who had been told she was magnificent and had believed it. She did not yet understand that Paul had married that energy the way a collector acquires something rare, not to celebrate it, but to contain it. It began with small corrections. At the Hargrove dinner in the autumn of their first year, she had told a story at the table, a long, winding, funny story about a runaway pig at her uncle's farm, and the table had laughed, and she had laughed with them, and on the carriage ride home, Paul had been quiet for a long stretch of road before he said, "You tend to take over a room, Elora. People are too polite to say so." She had turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead, his profile clean and unreadable in the dark. "I was only telling a story," she said. "I know," he said, and then gently, "I'm only telling you how it reads from the outside." She apologized. She wasn't sure what for exactly, but she apologized, and he squeezed her hand, and the matter was closed. That was how it always closed, with her contrition and his forgiveness, and the quiet understanding that she had, once again, been too much. By the second year, she had begun editing herself before she even arrived anywhere. She would rehearse her smallness on the carriage ride over, reminding herself to speak less, to laugh quieter, to let the conversation move around her rather than through her. She became skilled at this. Paul seemed more relaxed. She told herself this was what marriage required: accommodation, adjustment, the graceful compression of the self for the sake of shared peace. But the rooms kept shrinking. He began to make observations about her appearance with the same measured, concerned tone he used for everything, never cruel outright, always framed as worry, as care, as the private honesty of a devoted husband. "That dress doesn't do you any favors," said while she was already wearing it, already standing at the door. "You might consider the smaller portions, just for your health, Elora. I only say it because I notice these things," said at the dinner table in front of no one, which somehow made it worse than if there had been witnesses. She stopped wearing color. She began to move through the house with a kind of apologetic care, as though her footsteps were an imposition, as though the simple fact of her body occupying space was something she owed him an explanation for. The laughter she had once given freely became a rationed thing, spent only when she was certain it would not cost her.
The woman who had worn ivory lace gloves and told stories about runaway pigs began to disappear, and in her place grew something quieter and more careful and deeply methodically ashamed. She wrote to her mother once in the middle of the second year and said only that she was finding marriage more complicated than she had expected. Mary wrote back in 4 lines, "A man who makes you smaller is not loving you. He is decorating himself with you. Decoration can always be replaced. Come home if you need to come home." Elora folded the letter and put it in the bottom of her jewelry box and did not go home. She was not ready to admit what the letter meant. She was still trying to become thin enough, quiet enough, small enough to finally be exactly what Paul Bunyan needed her to be. She did not yet understand that there was no such size. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late October, written in her cousin Ruth's hand because Mary's own hands had by then become unreliable. It said only what it needed to say. Her mother was ill, the kind of ill that did not reverse itself. Elora should come if she was coming. She told Paul that evening over supper. He listened with his fork held above his plate and his expression arranged into something that resembled concern. He said he was sorry to hear it. He said he hoped it wouldn't be a prolonged situation. He said the word prolonged the way a man says a word he has chosen carefully, and Elora heard the machinery behind it, the calculation of inconvenience, the quiet audit of how much her grief would cost him in terms of social appearances and unattended obligations. She packed a single trunk and left on the Friday morning coach. The house she returned to in Chapel Hill was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to Clement Street's careful proportions, but it smelled the same, of dried herbs and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a home that had been genuinely lived in rather than curated for visitors. She stood in the doorway of her mother's bedroom and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not realized had been bolted shut. Mary was diminished in body, but entirely herself in every way that mattered. Her eyes were still sharp, still reading the room, still reading Elora the way they always had, with that unhurried, unflinching accuracy that had always made Elora feel both completely known and completely safe. She patted the edge of the bed, and Elora sat, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, and it was the most honest conversation Elora had experienced in 2 years. The months that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of her life. She learned to administer medicine in careful doses, to change linens without disturbing a sleeping woman, to sit in silence with someone she loved while the silence itself became a kind of language. She cooked the foods her mother could still manage and read aloud in the evenings, novels mostly, sometimes scripture when Mary asked for it. She laughed freely in that house. She took up space without apology. She forgot, for stretches of days at a time, to be ashamed of herself. Paul's letters arrived weekly at first, then every 2 weeks, then with a growing irregularity that she told herself was simply the busyness of a working man. They were brief and oddly formal, written in his careful, slanted hand, and they contained information more than feeling, the state of the household accounts, the weather on Clement Street, a dinner he had attended, a business matter resolved. He asked after Mary with the courtesy of someone inquiring about a delayed shipment. He never asked after Elora herself. Not once in 14 months did a single letter contain the question of how she was bearing it. Mary noticed. Of course she noticed. One evening in the early spring, when the window was cracked and the air smelled like thawed earth and coming warmth, Mary took Elora's hand and held it with what remained of her strength and said, "I want to tell you something true before I no longer can." Elora looked at her. "You have been apologizing for yourself since you married that man. Mary's voice was quieter than it once been, but carried the same unshakable directness. "I can see it in how you hold your shoulders. I can see it in how you laugh, like you're asking permission first. You did not learn that from me." "Mama, I am not finished." A breath, a pause. "You are not too much. You have never been too much. You are exactly enough, and the right man will not require you to pretend otherwise." She died on an April morning 3 weeks later, with Elora's hand in hers and the window open and the birds making an unreasonable amount of noise outside, as though they had not been informed of the occasion. Elora sat beside her for a long time before she rose, straightened her dress, and began writing the letter to Paul that would bring her home to a house she no longer recognized as hers. He did not meet her at the station. She had written ahead with the arrival time, precisely and without sentiment, the date, the hour, the coach line. She had not asked him to come. She had simply provided the information, the way one provides information to a person who can be trusted to do the decent thing with it. She stood on the platform with her single trunk and her mother's lace gloves folded in her coat pocket and watched the other passengers disperse into the arms of people who had been waiting for them, and she told herself the walk to Clement Street was not far and that she was not the kind of woman who required collecting. She was nearly right about that. The house looked the same from the outside. The porch was swept. The garden she had planted in their first year had gone slightly wild in her absence, the roses unpruned, the beds overtaken by grass at the edges, but the structure of it was still there, the bones of the thing she had made. She stood at the gate for a moment with her trunk beside her and looked at it, and something in her was glad to see it still standing, still recognizable, still hers. She went in through the front door, which was unlocked. The parlor had been rearranged. Small things, but she noticed immediately, the way you notice when someone has moved through your belongings with a proprietary ease that has nothing to do with you. The chair she favored by the window had been pushed to the far wall. There were flowers on the side table, fresh ones, arranged with the self-conscious artfulness of someone who was still new to the room and wanted to make an impression on it. She heard movement upstairs. She stood very still at the bottom of the staircase, her hand on the newel post, and listened to the particular rhythm of footsteps that were not Paul's, lighter, quicker, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had learned to move through this space without caution. Then a door opened above her, and a young woman appeared at the top of the stairs, and they looked at one another across the full length of that staircase for a moment that seemed to last considerably longer than it did. She was very young, 18, perhaps 19, with dark hair pinned loosely and a silk mourning robe that Elora recognized as having been purchased with household funds she had managed herself. She looked startled, but not notably ashamed. She looked, in fact, like a person who had been told she had every right to be exactly where she was. Paul appeared in the doorway of the study before Elora could speak. He was dressed, composed, and holding a folded document with the careful steadiness of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was committed to seeing it through. He looked at Elora the way he had always looked at inconvenient things, with a patient, faintly sorrowful expression, as though the inconvenience were somehow of her own making. "I had hoped to do this differently," he said. He set the document on the hall table between them. It was legal paper, stamped and signed, and entirely real. A formal dissolution of her claim to the property, drawn up by his solicitor while she had been sitting beside her dying mother reading novels aloud in the April light. He had used the 14 months of her absence to build a paper architecture around her removal, brick by careful brick, so that by the time she returned, her own home was a place she was trespassing in. She was to receive $20 and her personal belongings. She had 3 days. She did not cry. She would be precise about this detail later when she thought back on it. She did not cry, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not grant him the satisfaction of the scene he had perhaps expected and prepared a response for. She picked up the document, read it in full, set it back down. Then she went upstairs, past the young woman who pressed herself against the wall to let her by, and began to pack what was hers. It did not take long. He had already made sure of that.
She left on the second day, not the third. She would not give him the full allowance of time he had calculated for her, would not let the departure happen on his schedule in addition to everything else he had managed to arrange on his schedule. She carried her trunk to the end of Clement Street herself, in the early morning before the neighborhood was fully awake, and she did not look back at the house with the overgrown roses and the rearranged parlor chair. She had learned in those final hours under that roof that looking back was a luxury available only to people who had somewhere to return to. The $20 took her as far as Memphis. She had no plan beyond direction. West was not a destination so much as a decision, the understanding that everything she had known was behind her, and that the only geography available to her now was the kind she had not yet ruined by association. She rode coaches when she had the fare, walked stretches of road when she did not, and slept in the kind of establishments that did not require references or a husband's name on the register. She ate sparingly and without pleasure, and kept her mother's lace gloves in her coat pocket like a talisman, pressing her fingers against them in the dark when the nights became too large and too quiet to navigate alone. The land changed around her as she moved. The soft green humidity of Virginia gave way to the flatter, browner expanses of the middle country, and then that too began to alter, the sky widening in a way that felt almost aggressive, the vegetation thinning to scrub and dry grass, and the occasional determined tree standing alone in an open field as though making a philosophical point. She had never seen so much sky. It should have felt like freedom. Some mornings it did. Other mornings it felt like exposure, like the landscape was simply confirming what Paul had always implied, that she was too large a thing for any contained space, but too unfinished a thing for the open ones. By the time she reached the territories, the money was gone. She walked because there was nothing else to do. The road was pale and hard-packed and radiated heat upward from its surface in visible waves, and the sun was the kind that did not negotiate. It simply pressed down with its full and indifferent weight on everything beneath it. She had shed her coat 2 days prior, then her second dress, then any remaining pretense that she knew where she was going, or how far it was, or whether the distance was something her body could be reasonably expected to cover. She thought about Mary. She thought about the lace gloves and the April birds and the particular way her mother had held her hand at the end, not clutching, not desperate, but steady, the grip of a woman who had made her peace and was simply making sure Elora knew she was not alone in the last moment of not being alone. She thought about the staircase on Clement Street, and the young woman in the silk robe, and the legal document with its stamps and signatures, and the clean, bureaucratic efficiency of her own erasure. And then she stopped thinking about all of it, because her legs gave out. It happened without drama, one step and then not the next, her knees meeting the red desert dirt with a dull finality, and then her hands, and then the full weight of her, face down in the dust with her palms stretched open and her hair loose across her face, and the dry wind moving through the brush with its usual complete indifference to human suffering. She lay there for a long moment, the heat pressed against her back like a hand. And then something shifted, not in the landscape, not in the temperature, not in any external and measurable thing. Something shifted in the precise interior of Elora Chapman, a decision that had no words attached to it yet, only a direction. She had been running from something for 3 months. She was finished with that now. She was going to stand up and walk into whatever came next. She just needed one more moment in the dirt first.
She did not hear him coming. That was the first thing she would remember about Arthur Wilhart. Not his face, not his voice, but the fact that he moved across the land with the same quiet the land itself possessed, as though he had been out here long enough that the desert had simply absorbed him into its grammar. She was aware of shadow before she was aware of anything else, a shape between her and the sun, blocking its weight, and then hands, large, unhurried hands, turning her carefully onto her back, the way you turn something you intend to keep. He gave her water from a canteen without asking whether she wanted it, which was correct, because she was past the point of knowing what she wanted and needed someone to simply decide. She drank. He waited. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing yet to say. He brought her to the ranch on a flatbed cart, and she slept for most of 2 days in a small room off the main house that smelled of pine resin and clean dust. And when she finally sat up and looked out the single window at the flat, enormous expanse of the territory spread out in the early morning light, she felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. She felt like she was somewhere she was allowed to be. Arthur fed her and asked no questions. He was a tall man, weathered in the specific way of people who have spent years being honest with difficult land. Not hardened exactly, but distilled, reduced to what was essential and functional and true. He spoke rarely and without decoration, and when he did speak, it was to say something that required saying, which Elora found, after years of Paul's careful and weaponized words, to be an extraordinary quality in a person. On the 4th morning, he asked if she could work. She said yes before she had fully considered what yes would require. It required everything. The ranch ran cattle across 300 acres of dry, unforgiving terrain, and the work began before sunrise and negotiated no concessions for inexperience or grief or the particular exhaustion of a woman who had recently lost her mother, her home, her name, and most of her body weight in the dust of a desert road. She learned to mend fence line with wire cutters and leather gloves, learned the weight of a full water pail carried half a mile across uneven ground, learned to read weather in the color of the late afternoon sky, and to move cattle with her voice and her presence rather than with panic or force. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her shoulders, which she had spent 2 years round and inward in Paul's parlors, pulled back and squared themselves with the simple mechanical logic of muscles being asked to do real things. She ate without apology because the work demanded fuel, and her body had finally been given a reason to make non-negotiable requests of her. She slept without the low-grade vigilance that had kept her half awake on Clement Street, always listening for the quality of Paul's silence, always calculating its temperature. Some mornings she would catch herself in the reflection of the water trough and not immediately recognize the woman looking back. Not because she had become someone else, but because she had, slowly and without ceremony, become someone she actually recognized from much earlier, from before Clement Street, before the corrections on carriage rides home, before she had learned to audit her own laughter before releasing it. The woman in the water was broader across the shoulders and darker from the sun, and looked out at the world with the direct, unapologetic steadiness of someone who had recently discovered that she was, in fact, capable of surviving the unsurvivable. She did not talk about Paul to Arthur. He did not ask. But one evening when they were mending the south fence in the long amber light of a cooling day, Arthur paused in his work and looked at her for a moment and said simply, "You're different than when you came." Elora drove a post staple home with one clean strike of the hammer. "I know," she said, and for the first time and longer than she could accurately calculate, the words she spoke about herself were true. The settlement of Calais Springs was not the kind of place that appeared on official maps with any particular pride. It was a collection of perhaps 40 souls arranged around a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, and the particular understanding that everyone present had arrived from somewhere else and for reasons they were not obligated to explain. It was a community assembled from remainder, from people who had been too stubborn or too broken or too determined to stay wherever it was they had started, and who had found, in this dry and unremarkable patch of territory, that the absence of history could function as a kind of mercy. Elora first went into town on an errand for Arthur 3 weeks after she had arrived. She expected the particular scrutiny she had always received in Virginia, the social geometry of women's eyes moving across her frame and making their quiet calculations. What she received instead was a nod from the man behind the counter at the general store, a question from the woman sweeping the steps of the building next door about whether she was settling or passing through, and, upon answering settling, an immediate and practical invitation to the Thursday gathering at the church, where the women of Calice Springs convened to share resources, settle disputes, and collectively manage the ongoing business of keeping a small community from dissolving into the landscape. She went on Thursday. She kept herself quiet at first by habit, but habits formed in one climate do not always survive transplanting into another, and Calice Springs had no use for performed smallness. These were women who had crossed terrain that did not tolerate excess caution. Widows and wives of ranchers, a former schoolteacher from Ohio named Cecile, who had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. A young Mexican woman named Rosa, who had built a seamstress trade from a single borrowed machine and now dressed half the territory. They spoke plainly and listened carefully and valued a person according to what they contributed rather than how much space their contribution required. Elora began to speak, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, and then one Thursday in her second month, when a dispute arose about water rights between two neighboring properties and everyone was talking loudly and no one was listening, with the full, clear authority of a woman who had learned to read difficult land and difficult men, and understood that some problems required someone willing to stand in the middle of the noise and simply state the plain truth of the thing. The room went quiet. The dispute was resolved. Cecile looked at her afterward with the frank, appraising respect of someone recalibrating an estimate, and said, "Where have you been hiding that voice?" "Virginia," Elora said. Cecile nodded as though this explained everything, because in Calice Springs it more or less did. She began helping at the Thursday gatherings in a more formal capacity, mediating disagreements, keeping the ledger of shared resources, writing letters on behalf of women whose education had not extended to the formal correspondence required by territorial law. She organized a supply rotation for the 3 families on the outermost edges of the settlement, who could not easily make the journey to the store in winter months. She taught 2 of Rosa's younger sisters to read using the same novels she had once read aloud to her mother in the April light. The people of Calice Springs did not know what she had weighed in Virginia. They did not know about the dinners where she had been quietly corrected, or the carriage rides home, or the document on the hall table with its stamps and its $20 allowance. They knew only what she was here, capable, direct, reliable, and possessed of a laugh that she had stopped rationing, that came out when it came out, large and unedited and entirely her own. It was Rosa who said it first, simply and without occasion, while they were sorting donated fabric in the back of the general store one afternoon. She looked up at Elora and said, "This place is better with you in it." Elora held a length of blue cotton in both hands and felt her mother's words move through her like a current. Magnificent. Yes, she was beginning to remember.
She heard about his arrival before she saw him. That was the nature of Calice Springs. Word moved through it the way water moves through dry ground, quickly and along paths that were not always visible from the surface.
It was Cecile who told her on a Wednesday morning outside the general store, with the particular directness that Cecile applied to all information she considered operationally important. A man had come in on the Tuesday coach. Eastern clothes, good cut, the kind of luggage that announced its own expense. He had asked at the livery for the Wilhart Ranch by name. He had used Elora's name also, and the word wife, which had created a small and notable silence in the livery, because the people of Calice Springs knew Elora Chapman as a great many things by now, and wife was not among the categories they had assigned her. Elora received this information without visible reaction. She thanked Cecile, completed her errands, and drove the supply cart back to the ranch in the long, thinking quiet of a woman who had been handed a piece of news she had always known was coming and had simply been waiting to discover the shape of when it arrived. She told Arthur that evening. He was at the workbench in the barn, repairing a bridle with the focused patience he applied to all broken things, and he listened without interrupting and without putting down the bridle, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, working the leather through his hands, and then he said, "What do you need?" Not what do you want to do, not what did he say, not any of the questions that were about Paul. What do you need? She had known Arthur Wilhart for 8 months by then, and she understood that this was simply how he was constructed, oriented always toward the practical requirements of the person in front of him, rather than the abstract drama of the situation. "Nothing yet," she said. "I just needed you to know." He nodded and returned to the bridle, and that was the entirety of it, which was exactly enough. Paul came to the ranch the following morning. She saw him from across the yard while she was drawing water from the well, and the first thing she noticed, before the expensive coat slightly dusty from travel, before the careful hair somewhat less careful than usual, before the expression he had arranged on his face that she recognized as his version of humility, which he had always worn the way other men wore hats, for occasion rather than conviction. The first thing she noticed was how diminished he looked against the landscape. In Virginia, Paul Bunyan occupied every room he entered with the ease of a man who had been designed for contained and upholstered spaces. Out here, under the open and indifferent sky of the territory, he looked precisely what he was, a man from somewhere else in a place that had not asked for him and did not intend to rearrange itself on his behalf. She set down the water pail and waited. He had rehearsed something. She could see that from 20 yards away, the slight stiffness of a man moving through a prepared sequence. He spoke about the journey, about how long it had taken to locate her, about the difficulty of the territory. He said he had not expected to find her quite so, and here he paused, searching for the word, his eyes moving across her in the involuntary audit she remembered so precisely. "Quite so settled," he said, finally. The word landed with a flatness that suggested it was not the word he had initially reached for. Then he told her with the measured and sorrowed gravity of a man delivering unfortunate news he was bravely willing to look past, that the girl had gone, that the arrangement had proven unsatisfactory, that he had done a great deal of thinking and come to understand that he had treated Elora poorly and wished to make it right. He said he had come to bring her home. The word home fell into the dry morning air between them and simply lay there, unclaimed. Elora looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the brush in its usual indifferent way. Somewhere behind her in the yard, she could hear the steady sound of Arthur resuming his morning work, unhurried, present, asking nothing. She had waited a long time for this moment. She had imagined it in the early dark of many mornings, turning it over, rehearsing her own version of it. But standing here now, in the clear, undecorated light of the territory, with her calloused hands and her squared shoulders and the full, unrationed weight of who she had become, she found that she had nothing prepared to say. She didn't need anything prepared.
She let the silence stand for a moment longer than was comfortable. Not for cruelty. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had no interest in cruelty, but because the silence was honest.
And honesty had become the standard she held everything against now, including her own responses to difficult men in dusty yards. "Home," she said finally, and her voice came out clear and level and entirely unhurried. "Tell me what you mean when you say that word." Paul blinked. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she caught it. The fractional disruption of a man whose prepared sequence had not included a question at this particular juncture. He began to speak about Clement Street, about the house, about the life they had built together, and she listened with the same patient attention she gave to everything now, letting him finish because she had learned on this land that you do not interrupt a thing before it has shown you its full nature. When he stopped, she nodded slowly, as though he had confirmed something she had already known. "You didn't come here for me," she said. "You came here because the story you told about me stopped working. You told everyone I had fallen apart, that I had run, and then someone in Calais Springs wrote a letter or passed through Virginia, and the story changed, and you couldn't bear a version of events where I didn't need saving." She paused. "That is what you came to correct. Not my unhappiness, yours." He opened his mouth. She continued, not unkindly, but without any available space for interruption. "You made me smaller for 3 years. Not with your hands, I want to be precise about that, but with every carriage ride home and every dinner table observation and every dress that didn't do me any favors. You built a room inside me that was exactly your size and then complained that I didn't fit the rest of the house." She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at difficult terrain, without flinching, without drama, simply taking accurate measure. "I spent 2 years trying to become small enough to deserve you. I want you to understand that I now recognize that as the greatest waste of my life. Not because you aren't worth deserving, but because the size I would have had to become to satisfy you was not a size that was compatible with being alive." Paul stood very still. The expensive coat shifted slightly in the dry wind. His face had moved through several of its available expressions and had arrived, finally, at something she had never seen there before. A blankness that was not composure, but the thing beneath composure when composure has been removed. He looked, for the first time in her experience of him, like a man who had nothing prepared and no performance available to fill the gap. She reached into her coat pocket and found the ivory lace gloves, slightly worn now, folded as her mother had folded them on the day of the reception. She held them for a moment in her calloused hands, feeling the particular texture of everything they represented. The woman who had carried them down that Virginia aisle, the mother who had saved them, the months of desert and fence wire and honest labor that had stood between that morning and this one. She put them back in her pocket. "I am not coming home," she said. "I am already here." She picked up the water pail and walked back across the yard toward the ranch, toward the sound of Arthur's steady, unhurried work, toward the life she had built from $20 and a decision made face down in the red desert dirt. She did not look back. Not because she was angry, and not because she was performing anything for anyone's benefit, but because there was simply nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. Paul Bunyan stood in the yard of the Wilhart Ranch for a long time after she had gone inside. The wind moved through the brush. The sky remained enormous and indifferent. No one came back out to see if he was still there. He left before noon. He had nothing to say. She had seen to that. And the woman who had once been told she was too much had finally, completely, and without apology, become exactly enough. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.